But the reality is, this is our job. When we do it, we get a pat on the back. When whistleblowers come forward and articulate the same concerns, they often get retaliated against.
Corporate fraud works best in the shadows, behind corporate walls. How does the government bring these wrongdoers to justice? Whistleblowers. These are the stories of those who risk their careers to shine a light on allegations of fraud. Today on Fraud in America.
All right, welcome to this episode of Fraud in America. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into a case that's been on our radar for quite a while. This case settled last year, but for a lot of reasons you'll see as we get going here today, this case resonates with a lot of us because it signals perhaps the new trend in settlements, as we'll talk about today with our two guests. Dan Fruchter, he's an AUSA, Assistant United States Attorney out of the Eastern District of Washington, where he handles complex criminal fraud and civil false claims act matters. His cases have returned billions of dollars to the U.S. Treasury. His entire legal career has been devoted to public service, including when he came straight out of law school at the University of Maryland. He went to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He spent nearly a decade at Maine Justice in the civil fraud section, spent some time as a healthcare fraud coordinator in the Western District of Wisconsin, and is now Assistant United States Attorney in the Eastern District of Washington. He's a father. He's the owner of a dog named Cato the Younger. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
We also have Cleveland Lawrence III. Cleve is one of my good friends. He was also someone I hired many, many years ago at Taxpayers Against Fraud, where he served in various roles, including in my current role as executive director. He's now a partner, Marion Scalet. He's co-chair of the firm's whistleblower rights practice group. He was with Taxpayers Against Fraud from 2008 to 2016, went into private practice in 2016. He now serves on the President's Council at Taxpayers Against Fraud. He got a bachelor's degree from Georgetown, law degree from GW, and is also a dad. So welcome to today's show. Glad to have you on as we talk about this case involving Bechtel and AECOM that settled last year. These are two Department of Energy contractors. This case that we're going to talk about settled for $57.75 million. Dan, let's start with you. What are the basic allegations that came to light in this case?
Sure. So just to go into a very hopefully brief historical background. So the Hanford nuclear site is where all of this took place. The Hanford site is a very large site in southeastern Washington state. Near the Tri-Cities in Washington. During World War II, the Hanford site played a critical role in the Manhattan Project. Plutonium that was produced at the Hanford site during World War II ultimately was used in the Fat Man bomb that was detonated over Nagasaki that helped end that Second World War. Not long after World War II, the Army, which had operated the Hanford site during the war, turned control of Hanford over to the newly created Atomic Energy Commission, which later then became the Department of Energy. For the next 4 decades, really until the late 80s, Hanford was used to produce plutonium that was incorporated into our nuclear weapons arsenal for Cold War purposes. So essentially between the late 40s and the late 80s, that was the primary purpose of Hanford. Most of the plutonium that was used in nuclear weapons that were being created by the U.S., which of course was in an arms race with the Soviet Union at the time, was made at Hanford. In the late 80s, the Department of Energy essentially shut down the production part of Hanford and started what has been the biggest, costliest, most difficult environmental cleanup project in history. And the reason that I say that is because the plutonium process created very large quantities of some very nasty stuff. in particular, what we call mixed radioactive and hazardous waste. So it's radioactive, but it's also hazardous. It has other chemicals, even beyond the radioactivity. So even a Geiger counter doesn't give you a full understanding of the impact of this stuff. And this waste was stored in 177 very large underground storage tanks. When I say very large, each of these 177 tanks, I'm told, is approximately the size of a football field. And they're all underground. The records that were maintained during this Cold War process are not great. So often we don't know exactly what's in the tanks until they get opened up. But we know that they, contain stuff that we don't want. We don't want out into the public or into the environment. The tanks were originally designed to hold waste for 25 years. And so just thinking about what that means, it means that these tanks, some of them are now decades past their original intended life, and they're underground, so they're not easily accessible. The groundwater for the Hanford site feeds into the Columbia River, which of course passes through a number of heavily populated areas, including, Portland, Oregon, on its way to the Pacific Ocean. So this is a critical and urgent environmental cleanup project. Now, some of those original tanks have been replaced with newer tanks, but there have been some problems with the newer tanks as well. And, moving a football field's worth of radioactive waste from one tank into another tank is not an easy task. It's very difficult. And so that kind of leads us to this project, which we call the waste treatment plant project. The way that this was designed to work is that the Department of Energy contracted with a company, Bechtel, which is historically a construction and engineering company. They were part of the conglomerate that built the Hoover Dam. So they have a long history of, large, complex construction projects. And in this case, the Department of Energy contracted with Bechtel to design and build a waste treatment plant, a facility that would essentially be capable of taking the waste out of these underground storage tanks and immobilizing it, putting it through a high temperature chemical and physical process that would essentially turn the radioactive sludge, for lack of a better term, into a stable glass form, which won't leach into the groundwater. If you can kind of imagine sand that's contaminated with something. Well, if you can turn that sand into glass, then you no longer have to worry about, the contaminated sand blowing from, one place to another place. You don't have to worry about, water passing through the contaminated sand into the groundwater. You've got a stable glass form, which is essentially, something that is immobilized and no longer threatening to public health and to the environment. Bechtel then contracted with or subcontracted with another company. At the time, the company was called URS. They're now called AECOM. They've been through some corporate restructuring for the engineering support that would be needed to design and then ultimately actually run this particular plant. The waste treatment plant has been under construction by Bechtel and AECOM since 2000. And that includes the design and the build. So the idea of this project was you build, as you design. So this is not a situation where you have, complete blueprints and engineering drawings. Everything is done, and then you start building. The Department of Energy decided there just wasn't time to do it that way. And so this is called a design build, where different components are designed and then built. At least that was the plan. Kind of where we are now, the construction started in the early 2000s. Now, of course, it's 2021. They have not completed the plant in the original time frame, and the reality is they're nowhere close to completing this particular plant. The Department of Energy is hopeful that it may be partially complete, and they may be able to start treating some of the waste this decade. But realistically, they're not close to actually completing this plant, and that's kind of the situation that we're in, and that's sort of where the backdrop of this particular investigation.
So speaking of waste, Cleo, I'll go to you. The allegations that your clients, I guess, reached out to you guys in 2016. What were some of their concerns about the time overcharging going on allegedly at this plant?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jeb. It's good to be with you, and good to see you too, Dan. I actually, as you mentioned in your intro, was sort of just transitioning away from TAF and into private practice in 2016. So I wasn't present when the group of four relators initially came to us with their allegations. We filed that complaint in early 2017. So there was a period during which, our legal team, led by my law partner, Richard Condit, was sort of taking charge of that investigation process, along with our co-counsel out in Washington State at the Smith & Lowney firm. So we were sort of the East Coast Washington, D.C. team, working very closely with the West Coast Washington State team. But at that time, our clients had a variety of allegations, many of which sort of centered around this key issue of timekeeping fraud. Dan alluded to the significant delays that are going on with this project, and many of those delays can be attributed, I think, to intentional misconduct that involved manipulating work packages to overstaff jobs, billing for work that wasn't being completed while workers had nothing to do and were sort of sitting around, or finding recreational things to do on the job. Abusing overtime charges when overtime wasn't necessary to complete work, and a variety of other timekeeping types of fraud schemes. In addition, our clients had concerns about certain pricing issues and other safety concerns that were results of many of the issues with how work packages were being staffed inadequately. They weren't taking into account safety issues and other issues that were manifesting themselves with problems on the site that resulted in rework and additional waste and expense to the government. So there was a lot going on that our clients directed us to. We took some time to investigate those allegations and eventually filed a whistleblower complaint, a KETAM complaint, in 2017.
And if I have this right, Dan, I'm trying to follow the timeline here. There was a settlement that was announced in November of 2016 involving the same defendants, involving the same projects, different allegations. And then within a few weeks, these four relators are raising allegations involving the same defendants. Do I have the timeline right on that?
Yeah, I think exactly right. Those allegations, the time frame of those allegations was, of course, substantially before 2016. But that was a very serious matter that our office handled together with the Department of Energy Office of Inspector General. The allegations in that prior case had to do with the quality of the materials and components that were being installed into the waste treatment plant by Bechtel and by AECOM, which, of course, in and of itself is a very serious, thing. I mean, basically, when you're building a nuclear facility, you can't go to the local hardware store and pick up rebar. All the components have to be quality rated because of the, critical importance of, this project. And, those allegations had to do with the quality. They were brought by a different group of whistleblowers. Our office investigated those allegations. We ultimately intervened in the action because we felt like it had merit. And then that matter settled with Bechtel and with AECOM for $125 million. So it was, to use kind of the parlance that, I use in my criminal fraud cases, these guys were repeat offenders. They had a record. It wasn't coming out of the blue. The whistleblower allegations in and of themselves were very, very credible. And of course, that's always the most important thing is, how good is the quality of this information? But I think it was also very important to myself and the rest of the prosecution team, as well as the U.S. attorney, that we had just been through the barrel with these same two contractors on this critically important project.
Yeah, you mentioned repeat violators of the False Claims Act. In looking at the final settlement, there was a lot of things baked into this settlement that we typically don't see, including this 3-year independent investigation monitorship that must go on, that's paid for by the companies, but they report, of course, the the DOJ. Is that part of the reason why you decided to take some of these, in addition to an extensive statement of facts, which the companies admitted to? There's a lot of nuances that are very different here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, to me, those two things are both important, but they serve different purposes. The statement of facts, we felt it was really important that sort of standard False Claims Act settlement that's concluded by the Department of Justice, has a very short sentence that, it's a no admission, of liability settlement. And we felt like in this case, both because of the gravity of, these issues, the fact that it was not the first time that we were dealing with these companies and, on this very project, and just the egregiousness of the conduct, we just felt like it was not appropriate for the companies to cut a check and then be able to deny everything and say, well, we didn't do anything, but we just paid this amount, to make the government go away. We just didn't feel like that was appropriate in this case. And so what we required the contractors to do was enter into a lengthy agreed upon statement of facts so that, they had to come to grips with their conduct so that the public could see what happened and wasn't left to speculate as to, well, the government says this, but the contractors say this, and we don't really know, what happened. So that was the statement of fact. The purpose of the independent monitoring was really to make sure this type of thing doesn't happen again on this project. And so, what we agreed with the contractors on, and to their credit, they were incredibly supportive of this independent monitorship. The nature of these projects, the amount of space, the amount of time, the number of people, just the sheer geographic scope of the site means it's really difficult for any one manager or a government client to really know what's going on all the time. And the independent monitor isn't a magic bullet to fix that. But we thought it was a really important way of saying, we're going to have somebody who is physically present on the site, who has access to all of the relevant information, time charging information, project planning information, company meetings, access to company personnel, who can exercise some independent monitoring for the next 3 years to make sure that the companies have addressed this conduct and that it doesn't, take place going forward. Because, quite candidly, the people of the Northwest and of the U.S. just can't afford further delays on this project.
This concept of corporate integrity agreements is very, very common in the healthcare world, right? To have them agree to certain monitorships going forward. Very, very common. Cleve?
I just add to Dan's comments that as the relators and counsel for the relators team, we were very happy to see that Dan and the U.S. Attorney's Office felt that way about this sort of non-monetary piece as well. It was certainly something that our clients were insisting on as being part of the resolution of this case. Each of them had reported internally, these issues and saw that they weren't being adequately addressed. They had each suffered retaliation in response to their internal whistleblowing. It wasn't lost on any of them that these were, in fact, repeat offenders. And so, they wanted some type of additional measures to help ensure that not only were the companies deterred by the financial payments they were making over and over again, but that there was some independent means to monitor their behavior. So it was important to us as well, and it was very refreshing to see, this tool being used, which, as you mentioned, isn't always used, particularly outside of the healthcare context.
And that raises a good point, Cleve, because I certainly could see, thinking back over my cases over the years, all of my clients would have loved to see what happened here, right? That it's not about the money; it's about stopping the fraud going forward and making sure that that people have somewhere to go when they recognize something happening, right? That there's somebody that's an independent monitor in this example that they can reach out to. Dan, do you think this is a model that other U.S. attorneys' offices will start using, or do you think this is a one-off given the repeat offender status of the defendants in this case?
I can just say for our office, it's definitely a model. I mean, even in the settlements that we've concluded since then, we've been asking ourselves, and management's been asking us in every instance, is this something that we should do in this particular case? And if so, great. And if not, why not? And it doesn't necessarily fit in every situation. Sometimes the project is over. Sometimes, the personnel have changed so much that there's just, it just doesn't make sense. But I think in a lot of situations, I think we do need to ask ourselves, like, how are we going to make sure that this type of thing doesn't happen again, in every case?
We talk about the size of this facility. I looked it up online. It's really remarkable. Matter of fact, we should probably include something in the show notes to give people an idea of the scope and the size of this plant out in the Northwest. The other thing that struck me is in reading the press release, agents reviewing hundreds of thousands of documents, interviewed dozens of witnesses, cataloged hundreds of hours of video and audio recordings. I'm guessing that, Cleve, your clients also played a role along with the agents here. So you had 4 relators that were helping along in this case. Can you talk about your relators?
Sure. They are a mix, a diverse group of folks working at the WTP in a variety of capacities, who all each had, sort of differing pieces of the puzzle to help us tell the story of how much of this timekeeping fraud was occurring. And so they were able to form a small coalition and eventually, find counsel. And that eventually led to us representing them. They had each also suffered retaliation, and so they sort of commiserated in that way as well. And we were fortunate enough to be able to represent them in their individual capacities, and they each, settled their personal retaliation claims as part of this larger settlement of the Ketam allegations. So, it was sort of a holistic approach to serving the whistleblower and all of, their needs. And they were really extremely instrumental in not only helping us as the legal team get up to speed, identify key documents, identify key witnesses and other personnel that we could then refer to Dan, but we were able to use them to present directly to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they were able to convey some of those messages to the government team as well. I think in many ways, this was a perfect example of the private-public partnership that the False Claims Act, is supposed to achieve.
One of the primary missions of us starting the show was to spotlight the False Claims Act and its ability to go after fraud effectively and efficiently as a vehicle for the common person to help the government moving these cases along, and also for us to identify those U.S. attorneys' offices that we feel like are doing it the right way. So Dan, in looking at the final numbers here, 57 million and relator share near the maximum amount. Can you speak to why the relator share was a little bit higher in this case than some of what we've seen in other cases?
We did have it. We had an exceptionally good government team on this case. We had terrific case agents. Some of the best I've ever worked with. Carissa Otero and Adam Gianpetro were just terrific case agents. My co-counsel on the case, Tyler Tonabene and Frida Zimmerman, did an exceptional job. We worked very hard, but the reality is, this is our job. When we do it, we get a pat on the back. When whistleblowers come forward and articulate the same concerns, they often get retaliated against. And one thing we've seen throughout the nuclear industry and at Hanford is, retaliation against whistleblowers is, I think it's rampant. And so, I think it is important that we recognize that fact, because this is not the first, time that, we've seen, similar situation where the whistleblowers do everything that you would expect a good employee to do to try to address these issues internally. And yet the response of management is not only not to address them, but to retaliate against the individuals who raise the concerns, almost as though they're sending a message to others to say, you better not, rock the boat. And, that just can't happen. So I think that's an important consideration. I think always when we're talking about, how to assess the appropriate relators share, there are a number of factors. For me, it always comes down to the quality of the information and the contribution of the relators or the whistleblowers in any particular case. Where we have whistleblowers that are able to come forward not just with a tip, but with really detailed facts that they can support either with documents, or they can point us to documents within the company that we can go subpoena or obtain through a search warrant, or other means. That goes a long way. Where we have whistleblowers that provide what I call affirmative cooperation. People that are willing to make calls or wear body wires or do the other things that sometimes you see on TV. All that is part of what we consider in every case. And in this case, I think the four whistleblowers and the agents work together, hand in glove, really closely. The way that I think Congress intended when they passed the False Claims Act. And so, I think it's only working together can you obtain a result, like this one. And I would also say that it's great to have great whistleblowers, but it's also really important to have good whistleblower attorneys. And in this case, we had both. We had an extremely qualified and excellent group of folks. Cleve and his team that didn't just dump a bunch of documents on us, but really took the time to go through the facts with their clients so that they could present them to us in a really organized way that allowed us to, hit the ground running almost right after the tip came in. And so part of what we want to see at the Hanford site and in other places is connecting those whistleblowers, with folks like Cleve and his firm as quickly as possible. And so part of what we've tried to do in our district is educate our local employment bar on, here's what to look out for in terms of potential False Claims Act cases. And here's how to leverage the expertise of, nationwide bar. I think the Ketom practice is, by its sort of very nature, nationwide, whereas employment law tends to be fairly local.
Dan, your point about experienced Ketom counsel isn't lost on us. My wife is a fabulous OBGYN, but you don't want her doing your heart surgery. So the same thing in our world. If you're looking for an attorney to help out in your False Claims Act case, our membership includes 500 Ketom attorneys from across the country that aren't dabblers. These are people who are focused on the False Claims Act. Cleve, without a doubt, and I know this is true because we've heard from people, there's going to be somebody who is watching this show or listening on the podcast who is going to work every single day working for a company that is not turning square corners when it comes to the government. What would you say to that individual?
I'd say a few things to that person. I think that whistleblowers have sort of an innate sense of the environment that they're working in, and they know, sort of innately on some level whether or not an internal complaint is going to result in action being taken or result in sort of, outing them as the squeaky wheel that needs to be dealt with. So to the extent that a whistleblower fears that they may be retaliated against, I would absolutely, caution them to make sure they're documenting all of their processes for reporting internally and the reactions that they're getting to those internal reports. To the extent that a whistleblower wants to pursue a potential Ketom claim, as Dan mentioned, they really do need to have experienced False Claims Act counsel. In fact, sort of standing in the shoes of the United States of America by filing one of these lawsuits requires a whistleblower to have counsel. Whistleblowers can represent their own interest and be their own lawyers, but they can't be the government's lawyers. So that would be my next piece of advice is before, sort of pursuing this tactic, you definitely need to consult with someone who knows the nuances of the False Claims Act and can adequately represent all of your interests. My firm, Mary & Scallett, has been experienced in representing whistleblowers in all aspects of whistleblowing, and certainly has seen lots of folks from different walks of life and different industries, including this sort of non-traditional use of the False Claims Act at the Hanford site. And so, someone like us, I think, would be a good person for them to consult with.
So, Dan, there's a million reasons why we decided to showcase this case. 177 tanks the size of a football field. You sold me there. But why, beyond dollars and cents, why did this settlement matter so much?
Well, I think there's two reasons. I mean, the first is, again, I just think, this is a critical project. It's critical for environmental health. It's critical for public health. This needs to be completed. The taxpayers have spent billions of dollars, to remedy a very urgent situation. And I'm not putting all of this on the contractors or on this case, but the situation is not getting addressed as quickly as it should be. That's just the reality. And so when we have allegations that, contractors are charging for time that's not being worked, and, people are, sitting around, not because they're lazy or they're hiding from their bosses, but because they literally are not being given work to do, and they're not allowed to go do work unless they have a specific instruction to do something. That's something that we're going to take very, very seriously, because it's not about money. It's about how quickly can this project get completed, and how quickly can we get to this urgent business of cleaning up the site and protecting public health and the environment, as well as the health of the workers. Workers at the site are exposed to things that most people don't want to be exposed to. And the longer this project goes on, the more exposure those workers are going to have. That is not right. The project needs to be completed as quickly as possible. I think that would be the first thing, is just how critical this project is and how seriously we take those three things, workers' health, public health, and the environment. The second, thing that I'd point to in terms of what makes this case significant, I think, is because, unlike some of the False Claims Act settlements that you see out there, this was not a, cut a check and walk away situation. We had two very well represented, very large corporate companies that actually went through the process of publicly admitting to their conduct. I'm not going to say they were excited about doing that, but I give them credit for stepping up and doing it and engaging meaningfully about those facts and about the conduct that happened on their watch. I think that's very significant, because you don't often see that except in a criminal resolution. We're using them more and more, but this type of detailed admission by these types of defendants is just not something that we see every day. And then I also think that the monitoring, if it works the way that we're intending it and the way that I believe the contractors are intending it, I think that will go a long way to facilitating this project going forward. At the end of the day, that's everyone's goal, is to complete this so that the public health and environmental health of the Pacific Northwest can be protected.
I'd just add that I think, we traditionally see the False Claims Act's application in the healthcare realm, or, sort of more directly linked to defense contracting and the really big dollars that the government spends on those types of programs. And here we have a settlement involving, what is essentially an environmental cleanup service. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that the False Claims Act has a very wide reach. The government has its money and its tentacles and so many different programs, and is spending billions of dollars on projects like this. And the False Claims Act is a useful tool to recovering fraud on these projects, as well as in the more traditional realms.
Well, Dan, I wanted to acknowledge you and Tyler and the entire government team, and Cleve and Rich and the Relators Council, and certainly your four relators, for showing us all how the public-private partnership can work and should work. And I certainly want to acknowledge you, Dan, and your entire team in structuring this settlement in a way that will have a lasting impact beyond a check. So thank you both for joining us. Make sure you join us next week when we dive further into the world of the False Claims Act on the next episode of Fraud in America.
If you believe you've witnessed fraud against the government at your job, or want to learn more about these important laws to combat fraud, visit fraudinamerica.com. On our website, you can find whistleblower lawyers, blogs from these expert attorneys, and more. You can also find a transcript of today's show notes, a way to contact our team, and a way to chip in to make sure we can keep bringing you the latest on fraud. This episode was edited and produced by Rachel Brooks, and our theme music is by Connor Chaos. listeners. A big thanks to our staff and researchers of Jeb White, James King, Emma Bass, Jackie DeMar, Kate Scanlon, Brian Markovitz, and Max Boltman. You can learn more about them at fraudinamerica.com/team. Fraud in America is a project of Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund.